The river had always spoken. Even in the weakest summers, even when rainfall failed and the mountains dried to pale stone, the river never lost its voice entirely. It murmured along gravel beds, hissed through reeds, tugged gently at branches fallen from the forest. It shaped the land, fed the marsh, carried life downstream. The beaver had lived beside this river since his earliest memory, and its rhythm shaped every hour of his existence. But this morning, as he emerged from the dim mouth of his lodge, the river was silent. The beaver, broad-backed, thick-furred, old enough to bear scars from predators and seasons alike, dragged himself to the bank, expecting to feel the familiar pull of current around his legs. Instead, he stepped onto water so still it reflected him like polished stone. No ripples, no sway, no drift of leaves. He lifted his head sharply, whiskers quivering. The air was thick and unmoving, as if pressed down by an invisible weight. Not hot, not cold, just dead. Normally, morning winds swept down the valley, sending reeds rustling, guiding scents along the water. But now the reeds stood stiff, the air flat, the surface of the river dull and untouched. He slipped fully into the water. It barely moved around him. A beaver's body knew currents as instinctively as lungs knew air. He expected the water to carry him downstream ever so slightly. Instead it resisted, heavy and gelatinous, as though the river had become a stagnant pool. He swam toward one of his dam structures, built during the last thaw. Logs carefully placed, packed with mud, reinforced by new saplings. But something was wrong even before he reached it. The usual hum of water pushing through the dam, soft, bubbling, constant, was gone. He touched the wood. It felt dry, unnaturally dry, as if the waterline had pulled back in the night. He scrabbled higher, climbing onto the dam to inspect from above. On the far side, where water normally ran through gaps in the wood, trout sometimes leaping in the early hours, there was nothing, just still water hugging the dam's edge. He tapped the surface with his tail, a slap that should have echoed across the valley. Instead, the sound died instantly, swallowed by a thick, unmoving air. He froze, unnerved by the deadness of it. A great blue heron perched nearby, usually patient but alert. Today its wings drooped. It stared at the water as if waiting for something that refused to begin. The heron tilted its head, watching the beaver, then stabbed its beak into the shallows. It lifted nothing. No fish, no flash of silver. The fish had retreated deeper, confused by the absence of flow. The beaver turned toward the northern bend of the river, a deeper channel where currents always persisted, even in drought. He swam upstream, expecting resistance, the usual battle with the flow. Instead, he glided through stagnant water, every stroke too easy, too strange. A pair of otters appeared farther up, their sleek bodies cutting effortlessly through the surface. But they were not playing, not chattering as usual. They swam in tense, straight lines, noses lifting repeatedly to test the air. One of them let out a low, muffled chirp. No echo, no bounce from the nearby stones. Just a sound absorbed instantly by the still atmosphere. The beaver continued upstream until he reached the old birch snag lodged against a boulder. Water should have pushed against it. Instead, the snag lay exposed, the waterline several centimeters lower than usual, and unnervingly uniform, as if frozen in place. He sniffed at the base of the rocks. The usual earthy smell of churned silt was missing. He dove beneath the surface to inspect deeper layers of the river. Normally, cooler water below pulsed with life, eddies curling around submerged logs, gravel shifting in tiny cascades. But now the underwater world was eerily calm. Silt hung suspended, motionless. Small pebbles lay where they were, untouched by any flow. Even aquatic plants drooped downward, limp, as if starved of motion. He surfaced quickly, his heart pounding. Across the bank he saw unusual movement. Humans. 3 of them, wearing waders and bright vests, stood near tall metal tripods supporting equipment he did not recognize. They carried rods, dipped sensors into the river, scribbled notes. One woman's voice rose sharply. Velocity reading is near 0. 0. This river doesn't go still unless it's frozen solid. Another answered, bewildered. Pressure maps show water should be moving. Gravity hasn't changed. The gradient hasn't changed. Then why isn't it flowing? The Beaver crept closer, half submerged beneath an overhanging root. A third researcher shook a water sampler, frowning. Dissolved oxygen is dropping. Without flow, we're going to see massive die-off. The woman pointed upstream. And look at this. Surface tension's higher than usual. Something is making the water thicker. Thicker. The Beaver felt that too. Swimming was harder, not physically, but texturally. The river felt syrupy, as if unwilling to yield. He backed away cautiously. Farther downriver, he saw more signs of distress. A family of ducks paddling in tight circles, unable to drift naturally. A muskrat sitting on a muddy ledge, grooming compulsively, anxious without knowing why. Water striders standing motionless where they should be skimming. A kingfisher perched high, scanning water that refused to bring fish within reach. The Beaver dove again, swimming toward his lodge. He needed the comfort of its tunnels, the familiar darkness, but even underwater he felt the suffocating stillness. No current brushed his whiskers. No drifting scent hinted at upstream activity. When he surfaced near the entrance of his lodge, he noticed something alarming. The mud seal he had placed days ago had dried underwater. That was impossible. Mud in flowing water stayed damp, pliable, reshaped by each gentle push of current. But now it cracked under his paw. He resealed it out of instinct, pushing fresh mud into the gaps. But the mud behaved strangely, clumping too quickly, not smoothing, not dispersing. Behind him, a sound broke the stillness. A distant splash, but no ripples followed. He turned sharply. The otters again, one diving, the other watching. The diving otter surfaced, confused, spinning slightly as if expecting the current to carry it. Instead, it floated in place, bewildered. Overhead, clouds drifted sluggishly across the sky. Even the wind felt absent. The Beaver climbed onto a fallen log, surveying the quiet valley. Everything felt tense, strained, waiting. This was not drought, not dam failure, not seasonal change. This was a river that had forgotten how to move. He slapped his tail again, a sharp warning call. The sound vanished almost instantly, swallowed by the dead, heavy air. Animals nearby stirred. Ducks quacked nervously, otters raised their heads, but even they seemed uncertain. Sound travelled strangely. Danger signals didn't spread like they should. The Beaver lowered himself into the water again. He knew only one thing with certainty. If the current didn't return soon, if the river didn't remember how to flow, if the valley remained trapped in this unmoving hush, everything that depended on the river's breath would falter, then weaken, then fade. Flow was life, stillness was death, and the river's stillness had only just begun. Through the long afternoon, the Beaver lingered in the shallows, watching the unmoving water with a mix of instinctive fear and stubborn purpose. He had lived through floods that tore apart his carefully placed timber walls, through winters that froze the river into silent white stone, through droughts that exposed wide clay banks, but never had he known a river without breath, a river without flow, a river that felt more like a sealed basin than a living artery. The sun climbed higher, warming the surface slightly, but the warming did nothing to generate movement. The Beaver felt heat soak into the top few centimeters of water while everything below remained cold and trapped. The layering of temperatures, normally broken apart by currents, remained wrong, unnaturally separated, like a pot left unstirred. He pushed off from the mud and paddled upriver. His strokes cut the surface cleanly, too cleanly. No resistance, no pull, no undertow tugging at his tail. Just still water, heavy and dense. He approached a narrow part of the river where flow usually accelerated, rushing between boulders with a steady hiss. But now the rocks sat dry on their upper edges, no spray, no white curling foam. He placed his paws on one stone and hauled himself up. The top was dusty, dust on river stones, dust where the water should have splashed all morning. He stared at it, whiskers trembling. Below, a trout surfaced weakly, its body twisted, mouth opening to gulp at thin air. Fish only came to the surface when the deeper water lost oxygen. Without flow to circulate it, deeper layers had already begun suffocating. Another fish surfaced, then another. Some floated sideways before sinking again slowly, their movements sluggish in the unnatural stillness. He dove instinctively, wanting to check the lower layers. The water around him chilled quickly as he descended. No drifting sediment passed his eyes, it simply hung in place as though suspended in syrup. Even the sound of his own movement felt muted. He reached the riverbed. The usual patterns were gone. Gravel, normally shifting in faint trickles of water, lay untouched. The silt settled in uniform layers instead of swirling. Plant roots sagged without flow to support them. Tiny freshwater shrimp twitched but didn't swim. They had no current to ride. He surfaced quickly with a sharp exhale. The river was suffocating from the bottom up. He turned downstream this time toward a sandy stretch where muskrats often built burrows. Today a muskrat sat on the bank, not grooming but staring at the water as though expecting it to rise. The beaver approached it cautiously. The muskrat backed into its tunnel entrance but didn't disappear, just watched, motionless, whiskers drooping. The beaver dipped his head once, acknowledging the strange tension between them. Prey or not, competitor or not, every creature along the river shared the same fear now. A heron glided in overhead, but even its landing felt off. It touched the water with its long legs, expecting resistance from flow. Instead, it sank deeper than intended and stumbled, wings flaring. The bird steadied itself, then stared at its own reflection as though the river had become a mirror of false promises. The beaver sensed movement on the far shore, humans again. Their shirts were soaked with sweat, not from heat but from hours of wading through unmoving, heavy water. They planted another metal pole into the riverbed and attached instruments with shaking hands. One man knelt at the edge, dipping a small plastic vial into the shallows. "Oxygen levels are dropping fast," he muttered. "This is an active collapse." A second scientist shoved a probe deeper. "Gradient pressure is stable. Stable. There's no reason for zero flow. This is a gravity-fed river. It should be moving." The woman wiped a hand across her forehead, leaving streaks of mud. Unless something is increasing surface tension across the entire channel, something locking the top layer. The beaver watched curiously. She continued, voice shaking. "If the surface won't break, the deeper water can't cycle upward. It's a sealed lid, a lid on a whole river." A sealed lid. The beaver didn't understand the words, but he understood lids. He built them. He shaped water with careful damming. He slowed rivers, redirected flow, but never fully still. He used the river. He never stopped it. Only winter ice could halt a river completely. But this was not winter. This was not ice. This was something else. He swam toward his lodge again, needing the comfort of its familiar tunnels. But when he reached the entrance, he found the water level lower. The mud he had packed earlier was already cracking. Inside, the tunnels felt warmer than they should, stale air trapped instead of freshened by flowing water. He turned inside the lodge, inspecting the walls. They were drying from the inside out. Moisture always came through the walls by slow seepage. Without flow, even that process had changed. He left quickly, uneasy. Outside, ducks paddled frantically, wings beating small splashes that should have rippled outward. Instead, the splashes sank into the surface without spreading. The water swallowed them instantly. The beaver felt a heaviness around his body, a drag on his movements not caused by fatigue, but by water that refused to behave like water. A sudden commotion drew his attention. Otters again. They swam in tight circles, trying to stir the water, but every movement died quickly. leaving behind only small clouds of silt that drifted downward like snowflakes. One otter dove deep and surfaced with a sharp bark. It twisted its head, distressed. The beaver knew why. Deep water held no safety now, no oxygen, no circulation. He paddled toward a fallen tree and climbed onto it, surveying the river from above. The entire valley looked trapped in a deep, unnatural hush. No wind stirred the leaves. No insects hummed above the water. No waves lapped at the bank. Even birds seemed unsure how to behave. They perched on branches, watching motionless water with tilted heads and restless feet. The beaver slapped his tail again. A warning, a plea, but the sound was swallowed before it travelled 10 meters. Silence reclaimed everything. He felt something he rarely felt, exhaustion that came from fear, not work. He slid down from the log and swam to a reed bed, weaving through stalks that would normally sway with current. Today they stood stiff, imprisoned in a stillness they had never evolved to withstand. He heard the humans again. If the current doesn't return by tonight, fish kills will start. Temperature stratification will worsen. Algae will explode by tomorrow. Stagnant water is perfect for blooms. And once the bloom starts, oxygen will crater even further. The beaver didn't need their explanations. He could already smell it. A faint, sour odour rising from the water. The beginning of rot. The first exhale of a river that was losing its breath. He swam along the edge of the bank, circling his territory, searching for any sign of returning flow, a bead of drifting foam, a tug at his tail, the faintest swirl of sediment. Nothing? Not even at the narrowest point of the river. Not even where gravity should have forced movement. The river lay still, trapped in a strange equilibrium, as if held by an invisible grip. The beaver paused, lifting his nose into the air. No scent of upstream, no scent of downstream. Just the same thick, unmoving air. He tried to swim against the current again, out of instinct, not logic. His body knew which direction should resist. His muscles pushed forward, expecting the familiar struggle. But the water offered no resistance. He glided in silence, moving through a world that had forgotten how to move around him. The river was dying, not by drought, not by freeze, but by stillness, and the stillness was spreading. He looked toward the distant bend where the river curved out of sight. Nothing broke the surface, nothing travelled, nothing lived with ease. The valley waited, suffocating under the weight of unmoving water. If the current did not return, if the river continued to forget its purpose, if the world above and below remained suspended, then everything the beaver had built, everything he understood, everything that breathed with the river's rhythm, would fade in the quiet of a waterway that no longer remembered how to live.